Hi everyone, my name is Chris Pfoutz, and today I'm going to talk to you about choosing an application pen tester. And it's not even necessarily about just choosing a vendor to do your pen test, but how to build a program around application pen testing. First of all, a little bit about myself. I hail from Chicago. I lived there up until 6 months ago when I moved to Budapest, where I've been for the last 6 months. I've worked at Deloitte for the last 6 years. And most of that time has been spent around managing application security. And I've been in application security for about 8 years, 15 years in broad-based InfoSec, working for financial services companies, professional services companies, and a fintech company. I've got a mix of hands-on governance experience as well as technical experience. And I've worked on both sides of the table. So like I said, back in Chicago, I was building an application pen testing program and managing third-party vendors. And since I moved to Budapest, I am now managing an application pen testing team. I am SANS GX certified in both mobile pen testing and web application pen testing. And some of my extracurricular interests outside of application security are around mobile security and cloud. Specifically AWS and Azure. So let's start out with a little bit of input from the audience. First of all, how many of you in the audience are pen testers or have been pen testers in your past life? Okay, we've got a few, probably maybe 20%. How many of your companies have an internal application pen testing team that do pen testing for your own company? Looks like a few. How many of you regularly contract with application pen testers to pen test your applications on an annual or per release basis? There's a couple. And how many of you just do pen tests when the regulators or a vendor or a client asks you to pen test your app? None there. It seems like more mature programs. I'm going to leave the last category for those of you that don't do any pen testing. I'll let you be anonymous. So a little bit to start this out. First of all, these views are my own. They are based on my experience in building application security and application pen testing programs in 2 different countries. They don't necessarily reflect the views of Deloitte or align with our frameworks. The names of the stories, I'm going to tell you some stories throughout this. The names of those companies have been changed. It's because it's really hard to find a good application pen tester, and that's because of 2 reasons. Number one, there's a huge demand for it, and most of the companies that are doing work have plenty of work to do, and it's hard for them to even keep up with the work that they're doing. Plus, it's very hard to find qualified people to hire. So you're hiring anyone that comes in and looks qualified. So there's very few people that can do a great job with this. And I'll also tell you some stories of people who messed my stuff up. The details of those stories, because of legal obligations and lawyers and things like that, I'll have to change or keep to myself. But I'll tell you some of the stories of that. In fact, to kind of go back to that, one of the funny stories is I was giving this presentation and telling some of those stories, and I had a person in the audience come up to me afterwards and talk to me about it. And they handed over their business card to me, and it turns out that they worked for one of the companies that the story was about. So, why am I giving this talk? We've had pen testing around for a long time. One of the biggest reasons why I put together this talk is that I see a lot of organizations treating application pen testing in the same way as they treat infrastructure pen testing. And there's a lot of differences between it. And I'm going to point out a lot of those differences throughout the presentation and emphasize them more in depth. But some of the key points that don't really fit into the presentation are that vulnerabilities that you find in software code are virtually 0 days. There are things that haven't been found before. Yes, maybe it's cross-site scripting, but it's not cross-site scripting in the same way that it's been found in a different application. In other words, you can't apply a patch for it. You have to hand it over to developers, and developers have to fix their code and give it back. The second thing is that developers work different from infrastructure people. So kind of going back to the first point, to fix an infrastructure issue, you don't really need to plan for it oftentimes. You can apply a patch. You may need to test that patch in lower environments before you raise it up to production, but by and large, it's as simple as installing a patch. With developers, they have to code it, which means that it has to compete with functionality issues that clients are requesting in order to be fixed. So it needs to go in their backlog and prioritize from there. And then the last one is that I think application pen testing, and while this is true also for infrastructure, it's more so for applications, that it's more of an art than a science. You are not going to find all of the vulnerabilities. And we have many different ways of detecting application vulnerabilities: static analysis, dynamic analysis, architecture reviews, and pen testing. And none of those is going to find all of the vulnerabilities. And I get asked this question a lot by development managers. We're already doing static and dynamic analysis. Why do we need to do pen testing? All of those things should find everything, and it's not true. Layered on top of each other, you're going to find a lot more, but even all together, you're probably not going to find everything. So why do we pen test? Why is pen testing different from vulnerability scanning? Automated testing misses the complex stuff. Horizontal and vertical privilege escalation is really hard to test for with dynamic analysis. It's also hard to test. I haven't seen, and it's actually been a while since I've run a dynamic scan, but it's been a long time since I've seen a vulnerability come out of a web services test through automated scanning. But we find them all the time, particularly authorization bypasses when it comes to web services. And it also misses the simple stuff. A few years ago, when we were talking about when clickjacking started to be produced, found out, we were working with our vulnerability scanner, and it didn't even check for the X-Frames options header. And we went back to our vulnerability scanner, and we're like, why don't you just alert us to that? It's simple. And they're like, well, you can also resolve it through JavaScript in other ways, and it's a false positive, and so we don't want to flag on it. That stuff is one of our most common findings when it comes to pen testing. Another issue is we had an application that on the very first page, the most simple cross-site scripting attack, script tag and alert box, popped. And we go back to our dynamic scanner, and we're like, why are you, and this is an industry-leading scanner, why are you not finding this? And we tried to figure it out ourselves first, and they had to do a lot of research too. And they're like, oh, that was a JSON call. We don't support JSON. That would have been found in 5 minutes with a pen test. So now you're probably saying, okay, now Chris, I believe you. I need to pen test. But I have 500 applications in my organization. How can I pen test them all? It's expensive. How do I prioritize it? And I see a lot of organizations who pen test everything. Their goal, when they decide they're going to pen test everything. And you're setting yourself up for failure. You need to prioritize your applications. And so how do you prioritize them? The first one is, like I talked about earlier when I gave the survey on the audience, who are the people that pen test when the client, or when a client asks them to, or when a regulator requires them to? Those are the first things you should pen test. Get ahead of those client requests, get ahead of those regulatory requests. Pen test those applications on a regular basis to start out with. Secondly, I do believe, even though I've just badmouthed dynamic and static analysis and automated testing, I do believe you should be doing that. That is the low-hanging fruit. You don't want to be paying your pen tester a lot of money to find those simple things. So run those tests first. There's particularly dynamic analysis tools that are very, very cheap. Run those tests first and then give it over to your pen tester. And then lastly, I think you should prioritize those applications that are left over. In all the organizations that I've worked in this, taking this from banking, I've implemented a model where we start out with high-risk applications, medium-risk applications, and low-risk applications. Come up with a questionnaire that you can distribute throughout your organization, talking to your developers, talking to your product managers, and figure out what are the important things to your organization. Where are those crown jewels? Those are going to be high-risk applications. Sites such as ordering business cards and stock photography, that's going to be a low-risk application. You probably never want to get to pen testing those low-risk applications because you don't want to be spending $1 million securing a $20,000 asset. And when I say a $20,000 asset, that includes brand and reputational costs, which I understand is hard to calculate. Another way that I see organizations try to start to fail is they want to pen test every release. And I know that makes sense. You think that developers are putting flaws into their applications with each release. But what I found is, by and large, they aren't. We're trying to resolve technical debt. That's where the biggest source of vulnerabilities is coming from. And to try to keep up with your developer release cycles and all of the reschedules that you're going to have to do because the release is delayed, you're going to drive yourself crazy. So start out pen testing those applications on an annual basis, and then probably only with your most critical applications will you want to start pen testing them with each release. So what are the different pen testing approaches that you can do? How do we attack applications? There's a few different ways, and the first one I'm not really a big fan of. I would only use it for your least critical applications, but you need to be aware of it because maybe your clients are using, or maybe your vendors are using this to test their applications. So scrutinize their report, and the method that I'm talking about is doing a validated dynamic analysis. So firing up one of those tools like Web Inspector App Scan, getting the output, ruling out false positives, and sending you the report, and not putting any manual effort into it. There are many organizations, even reputable organizations, that are calling that a pen test. The next one is, and this is the most popular, to do a manual time box pen test. And you would take 5 days, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and give the pen tester that amount of time to attack your application, and when they reach the end of that time period, they would call it done. Or you can go the exhaustive route where you give them the application and say, whenever you think you're done, then finish it off, and you think you found all the vulnerabilities you can find, then you can go ahead and finish it off. The next level would be to go to a hybrid pen test, and there aren't very many organizations that do this, but it's taking the source code, and the pen tester would first look at the source code. They would look at the maybe the authorization and authentication, input validation, some of those critical areas from a source code perspective, and then they would attack it from a dynamic perspective, just like a normal pen test. But when they run up against certain things like maybe input validation, and they see something weird there, but they don't quite know what it is, instead of banging against it over and over again to try to figure out what the rule is, they can refer to the source code and know exactly what that rule is and get around it very quickly, and that makes for a more efficient pen test. The next one would be a full source code review, and outside of intelligence agencies or very heavy tech companies, this isn't done typically on a manual basis. This is typically done using a static analysis tool and a very trained assessor running that tool to look at the source code and understand vulnerabilities based on a source code perspective. And then the last one is a threat model and architecture review. And this really isn't done very often, and it isn't even offered very often, but it's taking the application from an architectural perspective, not just looking at the code, but looking how the servers are laid out, how the firewalls, the network segmentation, web server, those sorts of things, and understanding the application from a holistic perspective. I forgot the database. And if you listen to Gary McGraw, who's one of the foremost experts in software security, he says that 50% of your vulnerabilities are going to be flaws, which are from an architectural perspective. The other 50% are going to be bugs, and those are things that can be fixed. Static dynamic analysis, pen testing, that's typically what you find in those methods, and those can be fixed usually with a quick software fix, and the flaws actually require re-architecting the application, and it takes a lot of time, but that's half of your vulnerabilities oftentimes. Another question I am asked, and it's usually a big discussion and is even a big discussion with some of our clients, is do I pen test in production or do I pen test in staging/UAT environment? And going back to what's the difference between network pen testing or infrastructure pen testing and application pen testing, I actually recommend that people test in staging and UAT. And that's because if you're doing it right, a developer doesn't touch the code when it goes from staging or UAT into production. That's moved by application engineers. The code isn't modified We're looking at software vulnerabilities, not infrastructure vulnerabilities, so that code should stay the same. But at the same time, if you test in production, you are missing a lot of, or you are putting yourself at risk. I am aware of a situation where a trading company had a pen test, and it was done in production, and the pen tester corrupted the database. And that corruption got replicated over to failover. And now the backup's corrupted. That was, I believe, a 3-week outage, and the DBAs were working those 3 weeks night and day to get things recovered. So how do I choose a vendor? That's probably the next question you're asking. That's what the highlight of this presentation is about. How do you choose an application pen testing vendor? We don't really have review sites, and I'm sorry, these are review sites from the US. Consumer Reports is how you would choose your oven or refrigerator, and Angie's List would be how you choose a plumber or an electrician. Even Gartner and Forrester don't do a great job of rating pen testing providers from an infrastructure perspective, and I don't even think it exists from an application perspective. So how do you choose a vendor? Certifications, are those a good way? I'm a CISSP, does that make me a good hacker? CEH exam, I mean, the website was hacked. That's a screenshot of the site being hacked. That doesn't really look like a good way. I will say offensive security seems to do a really good job of training their pen testers, and essentially the exam at the end is a capture the flag event. Even that's not foolproof. So certifications aren't a way to find a good pen tester. Price. This one was really surprising to me. You would think that the best pen testers are also the most expensive. This was back in the US. I don't know if it applies here, but I called up a lot of application pen testers. How much does it cost for a 2-week engagement? All of them said the same price, except for one who was $25 cheaper than the other, and that turned out to be our best pen tester in the US. Even better than that, I went with Deloitte's team in Budapest, and we tested, and I'll tell you this method later, of after testing it with one of those vendors, we handed it over to them, and they found high and critical severity issues that were missed by the pen tester that we paid a lot more money for in the US. So price is not an indicator. Technical expertise. This is one, obviously technical expertise is going to be one of the things, but how do you gauge technical expertise? And even these aren't perfect, but what kind of technologies are the pen testers working in? Are they working in thick client and web services? Are they doing pen testing in that? What kinds of vulnerabilities do they find in those services? Ask them, and to make sure that they're actually testing those things. Are they testing mobile applications? I'm not talking about mobile devices, mobile applications. Do they understand how those work? What kind of vulnerabilities are they finding there? Embedded systems or cars. Now this is getting more on the bleeding edge. You know, assembly lines, cars, other power grid type stuff. Are they testing those sorts of things? That's going to show that they're having an expertise, and likely those testers that are testing those things probably aren't going to be testing your simple web app, but it shows that there is a level of mentoring that is going on there, because that knowledge gets passed down to the less experienced testers. And are they a thought leader? Are they posting research in the areas? And again, those researchers probably are not doing a simple web app pen test, but again, that knowledge gets cascaded down. And you're probably not going to find all of this stuff in the pen testing firm that you're looking at, but these are things to be looking for. I think even more important than technical ability, because a lot of people will do bake-offs against their pen testing vendors and find who is finding the most vulnerabilities. You hear me, I will probably say this in every one of my talks until the day I die. A big pile of bugs, finding a bunch of vulnerabilities doesn't make your organization more secure. The only way your organization gets more secure is if people are fixing those issues. So you need to integrate into the SDLC and into the way that your organization works to make sure that those pen tests are run effectively, and that you are passing those results on to developers and they're being handled right. So some of the things to look for: organization size. If you're a Fortune 500 company and working with a firm that has 5 pen testers, that might not be a good match. Now I'll talk about later how you should have a stable of pen testers and maybe they fit into that stable, but they're probably not going to have enough pen testers available to test the applications that you're going to be sending them. Do they support your model and testing approach? So I talked about before that whole line of different tests that can be performed all the way from the validated dynamic analysis to the architecture review. If you're looking at doing one of those tests, make sure that they support that. And don't make sure they support that by letting them ask you, well, what are you looking for? And you say, I'm looking for an architecture review. Because, of course, they're going to say, yes, we do architecture reviews all the time and we do a great job at them. The best way that I've found to handle that is to ask them, what are you good at? What are your key things? And I'll tell you if that's what I'm looking for. Last one is cultural fit. And one of the biggest things that I find around this is what kind of lead time do they need to do a pen test? If you get a call from a client saying, I need a pen test right now, are they able to deliver it starting next week? If you're doing this as part of the SDLC, this test is part of the SDLC, and your release gets delayed, are they able to accommodate that, allow you to cancel the pen test and reschedule it? This may not be important for every one of your pen testers, but you want to have a relationship with one pen tester that fits this mode. Those that need large lead time, maybe it's fine to work with them, but you need to have somebody that's there in an emergency situation. So the next thing you should do, once you've kind of got a short list of your pen testing vendors down, do a trial run with them. You're probably going to have to pay for it because, like I said, pen testers are in short demand. We've got a lot of work, and to do a free job, I haven't seen it happen. So if you'll want to do a trial run with them. And what are some of the things that you don't want to see? These are things that I've seen in doing my trial runs with pen testers. Uploading attack tools into your site and not telling you about them so that you can delete them. Leaving Netcat up there. Leaving Interpreter up there. Uploading unprofessional images. We had a situation where we did have to run a pen test in production, and the pen testing firm uploaded unprofessional images into a content management system, leaving unprofessional images to be displayed to clients. Do they miss meetings? If you schedule meetings with them to check up to make sure the pen test is going okay, are they missing those meetings? Are they missing your readout calls? These are things that show a level of professionalism. And then the other thing is obvious false positives. So when they run their pen tests and you're getting output, if they're just dumping something from a dynamic scanner into a report, you're going to have a lot of false positives. On the flip side, what are some of the things you should see? Well, one of the things to help understand about your pen tester is, as you're getting emails from them, you may get hints of who your project manager is, who is the person who's actually executing the pen test for you. Look them up on social media, see what their background is, see what their level of expertise is, see if they've given talks at conferences before. When you get the report, look for some unique and novel findings. You know the stuff that comes out of your static and dynamic analysis tools, particularly your dynamic analysis tools. See if that's all you're seeing in your report. If you're seeing some stuff that you don't normally see, then you know that's an indicator that they're doing a better job. This is starting to go into developing a relationship with your developer now. When they write their report, are they giving you a step-by-step for how to recreate your finding? That is the best way to train your developers. Your developers learn from the pen test reports, and oftentimes if you send them the report, they're going to go through and try to recreate the finding, and that will help them understand how this vulnerability is exploited and help them not to do it again. And then lastly, you'll want to see that your pen tester does a good job of communicating with developers. Can they communicate to the developers on their level? If the developer says this is a false positive, can they go toe-to-toe with them and say this is a valid finding? If The developer says this is going to break the application. Can they provide a different way of fixing the vulnerability, or at least reducing the risk, so that we can mitigate that flaw? The next step I want to go into is reducing headaches, and how can you smoothen out your engagements with pen testers. I saw this on both sides of the table, both when I was giving applications to third-party pen testers, and now on the other side, executing pen tests. Get your credentials as soon as possible. The biggest thing to delay a pen test is not having credentials. And the way that I did that was I created a scoping document. And that scoping document we got together with all of the teams that we did business with and asked them, what questions do you ask? And we're going to put those all together in one form and hand it over to you. And then at the bottom of it, we said we wanted the credentials right away, if it's as soon as possible. And that started to help ease that pain a little bit. Have rules of engagement with your pen tester. Some obvious ones are don't do denial of service attacks. Don't do brute force attacks against our login page. What are the times that you're allowed to test? Are you allowed to test 24/7? Are you only allowed to test during business hours? Are you not allowed to test during business hours? And what time zone do those business hours mean? Inform your blue team that you're doing a pen test, because that pen test, if you've got a good blue team, is going to set off alarms. So make sure that you're whitelisting your pen tester. This comes up to another topic that ends up being an item of contention. Whitelist. I think pen testers need to be whitelisted on the WAF, whitelisted on the IPS. Maybe not whitelisted at the SOC because you want to see their activity, but at least allowing all of the traffic through. Because yes, as a pen tester, I can get through, I can evade some of those controls. But if you really want me to be testing those controls, whether I can evade them or not, your pen test is going to be a lot more expensive. If you're really just looking for me to pen test your code, whitelist me on all those things. Otherwise, I think it becomes a red team exercise, and therefore a lot more expensive. Back up your systems. I already talked about this one, although in that case the backup didn't work. But back up your system so that if the pen tester corrupts your application, you can restore it quickly. This is kind of where I get on my soapbox a little bit and talk about developer relations. My passion is really working with developers and securing code. And that's been my passion for the last 10 years. Make sure you're validating your findings before you hand them over to your pen tester, or before you hand them over to your development team. It saves you face, it saves your pen tester face, and helps them trust you. Have a closeout call with developers. I already talked about that one. And the biggest thing is, this is something that we're starting to get ready for within our own team. We don't have clients requesting it yet, and very few organizations are doing it. I think a lot of .coms are. But PDF reports are useless. It goes to your developer's mailbox. It starts falling down the inbox, and eventually it's forgotten. The best way to deal with your issues is to treat them the same way you deal with functionality issues. Put them into Jira, put them into whatever issue tracking system or backlog management system you're using, and have them handled that way. Have them prioritized in the same way the functionality defects are. Getting short on time here, so I'm going to blow past this one a little bit. This one is around managing client expectations. When your client comes to you and says, I want proof that your app is secure, don't be intimidated by them. Follow some basic rules. Don't let them pen test your application. Provide them with a pen test report that you've already done. Don't give them the full details of your report. That will allow, if that report gets out, it'll allow people to exploit your application. Instead, provide an executive summary that shows the number of findings, and we as pen testing organizations are used to providing those letters. Manage the SLA for security fixes, just like functionality defects. I think a lot of times organizations think things need to be fixed right away because they're going to a client. Clients understand vulnerabilities take time to fix. Working with pen test organizations, I think treat your pen testing organization just like a partner. You'll get a lot more value from them that way. They're going to go more in depth in your applications. They're going to provide you better pricing, because if you're tough to work with, it takes longer to create the engagement. So what may be a 40-hour engagement with one company is a 45-hour engagement with somebody else because of the overhead and dealing with them. You'll also get additional strategy and consulting advice from them, probably for free. And this is the last point that I have, and I've alluded to this throughout the discussion. Make sure you have a stable of at least 3 pen testers. Work with multiple organizations. Number one, each organization has its strength. I think that some companies do really good at infrastructure testing. Some of them are really good at reviewing source code. Others are really good at looking at things from a hacker perspective. Organizations have their different strengths and weaknesses, and even pricing models. And you can use this to your advantage by creating a stable of pen testers. They also have different engagement models. Like I said, maybe not every one of your pen testers is somebody that's going to respond at the last minute or give you a little leeway when you need to reschedule a pen test. But if you have 1 or 2 in your stable, you can go to those organizations as you're needed. And then the last one is, I've told you some stories about some pen testers that we've dealt with, and we ended up having to terminate some relationships. And if that's the only organization that you're doing business with, it doesn't allow you to terminate those relationships. So you've always got a backup. You've always got somebody in your back pocket that if something really goes wrong, you can get out of that relationship. So here's my contact information. That's really all I have. Happy to take some questions. I think 10 minutes do I have? Any questions?
Hi. Yeah, so my name is Vlad. We met briefly before the talk.
Yeah.
I happen to work for Hewlett-Packard and help them actually develop and improve their tools specifically for Define Web Inspect. You mentioned at least Web Inspect in your talk, as far as I remember, and you said that you advise organizations to use them. The issue I have with web application scanners is that they may instill a false sense of security, because a lot of the customers that I approach tell me that, yeah, we already have a scanner. We run Nessus web application scanner on in our CI, so we're secure. Like, we don't need any pen testing or security engineering in our SDLC. Also, the cost of those tools is really large. Like, probably people outside Hewlett-Packard, those who have not purchased the software, do not know the price, but it runs in very high numbers. Surprisingly, it could cost several times less to do an entire code audit of the application, several times over in a year, in the same amount of money that it costs to do a web application scan. So the question, since it's a question, not just an addition, would be, have you really seen any efficiency from a web application scanner in terms of real findings found compared to findings found by manual penetration testing, like at least of 10%?
I have, in particular, and this is where I talked about, a lot of the vulnerabilities that seem to be found are technical debt, particularly when you've got an application that's been around for 10 years. It's a good first sweep to go and see, what are my problems here. There's cross-site scripting all over the application, or there's SQL injection. A lot of times it does find a lot of those low-hanging fruit. I think too, there are cheaper tools out there that don't necessarily cost the same as some of the leading tools that can do maybe as good of a job as those that are more expensive. A lot of the value add around those tools is the centralization for organizations that have a large portfolio of applications, so that they can centralize those reports, they can do trending analysis, and they can do some more automation and centralization around those scans. Are there any other questions?
Then I'll probably ask another question if no one is asking. Do you think it's worthwhile to sift through all the false positives from the scanners? Like even if you have, as you said, like 500 applications and you run them, maybe the same time that was spent looking at false positives could have been used to actually test some of the applications when you do all the risk sorting of them?
That's a good question. Certainly with automated scanners, it may make more sense to allow the developers to find those false positives for you. Or at the very least sift through some of the high-end critical severity issues first, because presumably those are going to be the issues that you're going to prioritize and you're going to put pressure on your development team to fix. And if you're putting pressure on them, you should be sure that it is a valid issue. Pen testers, you want to validate their findings the first time through, but once you establish a trust in them that they're not throwing you a bunch of false positives, it's probably not worthwhile for you to test those issues yourself. You want to make sure that your pen tester is doing it for you.
Ще є у когось питання? Да, є.
I took away from your presentation that you don't think very highly of automated testing. Do you see any improvements for the future year, also taking into consideration like application of artificial intelligence in automated testing, that they are going to be of bigger support in the coming years?
I wouldn't say that I'm not a fan of I'm not a fan of automated testing. It has its place, but I don't think it covers all of your vulnerabilities. And there's certain categories of vulnerabilities that it does a really poor job at. And so I think you need to augment it with pen testing. What do I see for the future? Unfortunately, for a lot of the leading vendors, I'm not seeing much innovation when it comes to automation. I'm not seeing them integrate those things that they may advertise into their tools. And in fact, one of those tools got bought by a company where it's widely known throughout the industry. It's where good companies go to die. I'm not sure at this point I see a lot of hope. I hope that there is innovation going on in the automation space that can make use of artificial intelligence. Actually, you know what? I need to take that back because I haven't talked much about RASP. And this is really being integrated into the web server, and it's inspecting the traffic as it during real time as the application is being used, and it detects attacks almost like an intrusion detection system. And I think that has a lot of promise. I haven't used those tools, and I've heard that they still need some development, but I think that actually offers a lot of promise.